So I just want to reiterate to everyone how wonderful it is that people are coming together from all over the state, all over the country. Even a few stragglers from other nations are joining us at this point in time. And this would not be possible without our amazing support from the California Department of Public Health, Blue Shield of California, our home base, UC Berkeley School of Public Health, Center for Health Outcomes and Innovation Research. We have wonderful collaborative activities with health plans, medical groups, academia, biopharmaceutical, and the California chapter of the American College of Cardiology. So our raison d'etre is to improve practices, improve outcomes for patients and families, keeping families together longer. We do post all of our materials for free. They're up on our website, and we are going to make an effort this year to make all of our sessions more accessible on our website, possibly through some of our sessions will be on enduring continuing medical education. With that, next slide, please. Most of you know me by now. I've been so blessed to co-found the Right Care Initiative with many of the people that are with us today, founding different regions and helping us to build the program. Next slide, please. This is the reason for the Right Care Initiative, is that we want to address these numbers. We drive this program using data so that we know how to prioritize. And critically important to recognize that for those things that we regularly screen for the cancers that everyone has in their mind from the public service announcements and the clinical focus, turns out that for men and women as early as age 35, cardiovascular diseases, whether it's heart attack, stroke, or hypertension death, are killing more people than the prominent cancers that we're all so well aware of. So we need to help switch the cultural perception about what's actually killing us. And we need to work harder at addressing the preventive efforts that we're all here enthusiastically supporting. Next slide, please. So very importantly, we will have with us the author of this study, Dr. Steve Sidney, the head of the research clinics for Northern California Kaiser, in a few minutes. He is has another obligation until approximately 4:45. But when I asked him, at what age does atherosclerosis start for women in particular, because Katrina and I were working on, Dr. Taylor and I were working on a brief for improving women's cardiovascular outcomes. He sent me this wonderful table from the Cardia study, which is a study of atherosclerosis among the young. And I was very surprised to find that by age 45, 1 in 20 women and 1 in 7 men already have atherosclerosis. And those people need preventive care, and they need to be triaged to be prioritized. Next slide, please. I wasn't sure that our chairman, Balmer, was going to be with us, and normally I have him talk through this slide, but I'll just quickly say that over the years, we have synthesized the best practices that we've heard into this nice little graphic, which you can find on our website, where at the apex of our work is activating the patient to be the CEOs of their own bodies, to reduce stress, adhere to the optimal medication therapy formula that their clinical teams provide to them, to also enhance sleep, nutrition, and physical activity, stop smoking. And we are working to spread evidence-based patient education materials. And one of the very effective strategies is motivational interviewing with evidence-based materials. So we believe in team-based care. We know that guideline-directed protocol care works for patients. We want to encourage everyone to use home blood pressure monitoring. And with that, next slide, please. So we have a fantastic agenda today. Jeff Klingman has been with the Right Care Initiative. I think his first meeting with us was 2014 at Berkeley. So that's 8 years, and a major stroke leader will be essentially the first hour of our program. Our co-chair from Stanford, Nirali Vora, will be facilitating the Q&A portion for Dr. Klingman, and also showing us a wonderful video that you all are going to love, Salsa for Stroke. We will then hear about a very important aspect of stroke prevention and care, and that's hypertension management, from both Steve Sidney and Dr. Mai Nguyen-Huynh. And then our chairman, Bill Baumer, will facilitate the last portion of the Q&A. Next slide, please. So without further ado, I would like to introduce our keynote speaker for our 305th University of Best Practices, Dr. Jeff Klingman, who is the head of, he's the chair of the Chiefs of Neurology for Northern California, Kaiser Permanente, and the assistant chief of staff. He's done magnificent work at Kaiser, speeding up and improving stroke care. And with that, I'll say, take it away, Jeff. You are muted. If you would please unmute.
All right, sorry. What I wanted to talk to you today about was the need for speed presented at the International Stroke Conference this year. We looked at one more aspect of rapid treatment. But I also want to go over just kind of what the population of stroke patients looks like, and make an argument that we really need to treat and in all aspects of the stroke care more quickly and more efficiently, and that this is something that we can do in California. But it's, you know, we really need to establish some standards around treatment. Have the next slide. So talking about efficient stroke systems, I want to talk about why speed matters. And we're going to focus to begin with in treatment in the golden hour. So the golden hour is within treating a patient within 1 hour of stroke symptom onset, which is quite a challenge, and why that's important. But then I want to go on and talk about the population of acute stroke patients that are brought into the hospital, so that we can have an understanding of the relative frequency of patients getting treated with thrombolytics versus large vessel occlusion, what kind of patients are brought in by EMS, and then another little bit of a discussion about the current tools that have been proposed to make transportation and destination decisions, and an argument that if everybody treats and transfers quickly, it doesn't really matter where you take them. It makes more sense to get them to the closest hospital quickly. And then a bit of a challenge that can we in fact get everybody to treat and transfer quickly, so that everybody with a stroke, no matter where they are in the state, has an opportunity for the best possible outcome. Have the next slide, please. So we need to do fast field evaluation and transport. We need to do fast door to needle, like less than 30 minutes. We need to do fast CT angiogram and results. We need fast door in and door out, and we need fast door to groin at the thrombectomy center. Next slide. So first thing I want to talk about is the treatment in the golden hour. Next. I have no disclosures. Next. So this was presented at International Stroke Conference this year in New Orleans. And next, please. So golden hour treatment, early treatment with thrombolytics improves stroke outcome, and thrombolytic treatment is exquisitely time sensitive. And basically, we know that within 4.5 hours, we lose the benefit in most patients. But it's also been proposed that if you get to them within that first hour, there's sort of extra benefit, that 1 hour treatment from stroke onset, which is very fast, has a much more profound effect on outcomes. And it's been shown in some studies that it can improve stroke outcome, but also increase the canalization rate in patients that do end up with large vessel occlusion. So you may end up, by the time you get them to a thrombectomy center, that the vessel's already open because you were able to deliver a thrombolytic so quickly. Now, the problem is there's been very low rates of treatment within 60 minutes typically reported, and usually within less than 5%. So there was a big study recently reported and put in the New England Journal where they looked at stroke ambulances, where they were able to treat a pretty high number, up to about 30%. They compared with the group that was not in the stroke ambulance, it was less than 3%. So we decided to go ahead and look at it in our system. Next. So Northern California Permanente, for those of you, or Kaiser Permanente, for those of you that don't live here, is a pretty big operation. 4.5 million members is the size of some small countries. We have 21 hospitals. We cover 17,000 square miles. We do more than 1,000 thrombolytic cases per year. We're a little unique in that teleneurology sees every stroke patient on arrival to the emergency room. So if there's a suspected stroke, we get called and greet them at the door along with the emergency room doctor, or if they walk in, the same thing happens. And in 2015, we started a streamlined evaluation and thrombolysis process where we treat more than half the patients in less than 30 minutes. And if you go through with the official AHA exclusions, it's actually now more than 70%, pretty reliably. And we also, when we put this program together, we did data collection on all patients with a standardized note. So it's easy for us, easier, to go through and actually pull data so that we know exactly what we're doing. Next, please. So I had 3 questions for the study. What was our rate of acute stroke treatment during the golden hour? Given the fact that we're treating within a half an hour, you would expect that the number would be quite a bit higher than the 3% previously reported, or less than 5%. And we want to know what factors affected our ability to treat within an hour. But we also want to go through and see if we could see if this had any effect on outcomes. So whether in fact we were able to reproduce what people have suggested before. Next, please. So looking at where these are different facilities, numbered 1 through 21, and what you can see is a couple things. Number one, there were a total of 3,000 people over the treatment time period. The average rate of golden hour treatment was 14%, which is quite a bit higher. But the range was kind of amazing. It ranged from 5.8% to 20% based on which hospital you're in. So that's a little bit interesting about how, and these are only EMS arrivals. So it didn't matter whether they happened to have a higher rate of walk-in. It's just at some places there was a big difference. So that's always kind of eye-opening. And this was patients arriving basically at all KP facilities from January 1st, 2016, which is when we started at every facility, our new process, through August 31st, because you have to at some point turn off your data collection in order to submit your abstract for the conference. Have the next slide. So looking at the characteristics, because we wanted to see what the patients look like that did manage to get there. We found that the difference in golden hour treatment, which is pretty interesting, is that that more men came in the golden hour than women. We didn't see any differences based on whether patients were KP health plan members. We treat a lot of non-health plan members in some of our facilities. We saw no racial or age differences. Next. There were some factors that were associated with ability to treat within the golden hour. First off, if they had an actual stroke as opposed to a stroke mimic, they were treated more quickly, which kind of makes sense. If it's a mimic, you may spend more time trying to figure it out. The NIHSS tended to be higher. Again, no surprise. Bigger strokes are easier to recognize and figure out you're going to treat quickly than smaller ones. Also, they're more likely to be potentially brought in more quickly. There were more large vessel occlusions, not surprisingly. Bigger strokes will potentially present more quickly. And as a consequence, of course, more patients were sent for endovascular stroke therapy. There was a faster door-to-needle time in the golden hour treatment patients. And also more patients were treated in less than 30 minutes. So that may have had a factor. That's something you want to look at. Was it our ability to treat quickly that made an effect? And then time last known well to arrival, of course, was that's obvious. On the next. So we went back and looked at the correlation, and in fact, there was a correlation between median arrival time and ability to treat. So if they got there quicker, we were able to treat them more effectively with a reasonable level of correlation. Next. But what we found is that it had nothing to do with after they hit the hospital. After they hit the hospital, the door-to-needle time was a remarkably stable 30-ish minutes, as you can see at every facility, and it didn't correlate really at all. 0.11 is lousy correlation with our ability to treat them in that golden hour. Next. So then what we did is we said, look, if you're going to treat this patient within an hour, they kind of got to be there in 40 minutes because, usually we get them, you're going to be able to treat them in 20 minutes, but it's hard to get much faster than 20 minutes. I mean, we've done it, but it's not everything, all the stars have to align. So, but the thought was if they get here in 40 minutes and you can treat them in 20, you really ought to be able to get them treated within an hour. And in fact, there's a pretty remarkable correlation of 0.78 with the arrival in less than 40 minutes and the ability to treat within the golden hour. Now, if you'll recall, there was a big, big difference between facilities. So it's super interesting to me that the arrival was quite a bit different between facilities in that first 40 minutes, which allows us to then treat them within the first hour. Next. So we went back and looked at outcomes. Now, we didn't have full ranking over this time period. Back in the earlier days, we were not routinely collecting ranking. So to look at outcomes, we basically looked at mortality. We do have mortality data going back for the entire cohort, and there was a significantly lower mortality in patients treated in the golden hour versus those not treated with, you can see the 0.0006 level. That's pretty darn remarkable, I think. And we also saw that, and this is the model that corrects for all those different factors that we talked about that were different between age and NIHSS and so on. So the model takes into account the differences and comes up with what is the effect of just golden hour treatment, and it's pretty powerful. Now, in patients treated in the golden hour, we then went through and stratified whether we were able to treat the door-to-needle in less than 30 minutes versus more than 30 minutes. And you'll see that in the door-to-needle less than 30 minutes, there was a better odds ratio, that basically there was a reduced mortality, even in that group. So if they get here within an hour of stroke onset symptoms and you treat them faster, they still do better than if you treat them slower. It really gets down to the idea that every single minute counts, even if you're treating them within an hour. Next. So in conclusion, we found treatment within the golden hour was associated with lower 90-day mortality, that facility door-to-needle performance did not influence our ability to treat them within the hour, but arrival within 40 minutes was highly predictive of our ability to treat them quickly. And the rate of arrival within 40 minutes of symptom onset varied pretty dramatically between facilities. To me, what this indicates is that if we're going to talk to EMS agencies, they really ought to consider protocols to minimize any time before they get to the hospital with transport and evaluation, because if they can get it to us quickly, it makes the difference. We don't know how much was patient characteristics about delaying the call, but we do know that these delays matter. And I would go back to our public health messaging, which we've had all along, but just the continued need to call 911 for any stroke symptoms. And the sooner you do it, the better. Don't wait for it to get better. And I think that from an EMS standpoint, I would, if you can minimize the scene time by 10 minutes, you can potentially make a big difference. Next. So I wanted to then talk about what else we could do besides just scene time. What else can be done in terms of looking at your stroke population? Who comes in? What would it look like to have a truly efficient stroke system? Next. So there hadn't been a whole lot of work on looking at whole populations. People tend to focus on, things after they get to the hospital and are diagnosed with stroke. What's your treatment rate? Or they focused on, endovascular patients in treatment, but not really looking at the entire universe of what gets brought into the hospital. So we published this study in 2009 or in 2021 about the potential accuracy of pre-hospital NIHSS-based triage for selected candidates. So we were looking at what the population looked like, and also how well we could select patients for potential endovascular treatment. Next slide. So, we looked at patients who were brought in by EMS and wanted to know who didn't have a stroke eligible for any treatment. That would look at mimics. We wanted to know who had incorrect last known well time. We wanted to know who got treated with thrombolytics, and we wanted to know who eventually got treated with mechanical thrombectomy to characterize this group of patients. What the universe looks like of patients being brought in for possible stroke. Next slide. So this is kind of the population. I'm sorry, the slide's a little small to read, but there's a lot on here. Essentially, what we saw were that there was about 13,377 people were delivered to us for possible suspected stroke. Remember, every one of them seen by the neurologist. And it turns out that 53.6% of the people that were first brought in didn't have a stroke eligible for any kind of an acute treatment. So more than half of people that were delivered by EMS ended up not being eligible for any acute treatment. I said no stroke. It's no acute stroke eligible for treatment because some of these may have had a stroke that had been there for 3 days, but there's no available acute treatment for those, obviously. Next. So looking at what the reasons were that they were not candidates, stroke mimics were about a third. That shouldn't be too surprising. I'm not sure that's a bad number because we'd like an index of suspicion from EMS that's enough that we don't miss many of them. A lot of those mimics end up with things like sepsis, but we'll see things like intoxication. A lot of things will cause apparent acute changes that could be a stroke. Because we're seeing people so quickly, about 30% of them had symptom resolution. So what that means is we're seeing TIA patients. That's fine. We should be evaluating those. But concerning to me is that the time last known well was out of range in 16.5%. I do see a lot of these patients, and it's pretty frustrating when the time last known well is reported at it actually was at 5:30 this morning, and only to find out when the family finally comes in, even though we tried desperately to call them, that last known well was actually the night before, because it totally changes your approach to treatment. And so we really need that number to be super accurate. And it's not the time they were discovered, it's the time they were last seen normal by somebody. Next, please. So then we want to go and look and see, well, what's the relative rate of patients that get treated with thrombolytics? And I broke this down because I'll explain in a minute that we were looking at people that likely would have been diverted if you had a diversion scheme past a closer hospital to another hospital, which i.e. those are the larger strokes with a score of NIHSS score of more than 10. And just bottom line, about 45% of the actual stroke patients, so of the 13,377 brought in, 6,089 actually were candidates for acute treatment. And of those, about 45% get treated with thrombolytics. The ones that aren't treated, there's just a variety of reasons. Maybe the stroke gets better. Maybe some of them had a bleed. Some may have had contraindications. There's a whole bunch of different reasons that it's 45%, but that's actually a pretty good number. Next. Now, if you look at the thrombectomy, of the total that were brought in, 15% or 884 are treated with mechanical thrombectomy. Some of these had smaller strokes, less than 10. Those are the two left-hand circles. And some had larger strokes, and those are on the right. But the overall number was about 15%. So about a third the size of the group that gets treated with thrombolytics. Next. So if you're going to try to do some kind of selection for who goes to which facility, because it's a compelling argument, if you just could really figure out who had large vessel strokes, you would only send them to thrombectomy centers. And everybody agrees with that because it's the idea is the right patient to the right hospital. The problem that we see is that that's not very reliable. Next. Because what we did is we looked at our ability to decide who likely had large vessel occlusions based on a full NIHSS exam. Now let me back up a little bit. The NIHSS is the standard stroke exam that looks at a lot of different items to try and figure out how big is the stroke, is it a stroke, and so on. And the full NIHSS, it's pretty quick, but it's considered by most to be really too cumbersome for field use by paramedics. It's just a lot of stuff. So a lot of folks have come up with sub items out of the full NIHSS to try and pick them. One of the more common ones, for example, is the race scale, but you'll also see GFAST and so on. There's actually at least 19 scales I was able to count up to try and choose which patients had large vessel occlusion. We looked at the whole NIHSS, so the whole thing, and what the likelihood was of the patient actually ending up with endovascular treatment and a large vessel occlusion. And looking at this receiver operator curve, the best cutoff was NIHSS of greater than 10. So 11 up versus less than 10. And for that score of greater than 10, 27% ended up treated with mechanical thrombectomy. So even then, it's not everybody, it's not the majority, but it's a good number. Next. But interestingly, large vessel occlusions in treatment can occur with any score. So in orange are the patients that ended up getting referred for mechanical thrombectomy, and in blue is those that didn't. And I will point out that there were patients with a score of 0 or 1 that ended up with mechanical thrombectomy. We've had people walk in with basilar artery occlusions to where the scale didn't pick them up. Now, obviously, it's the bigger strokes more likely to have a large vessel occlusion. But as I said, you're going to miss patients. You're going to miss a fair number of patients if your only cutoff is the score. Next. So the bottom line is about half of the EMS suspected strokes either weren't strokes or weren't eligible for any acute stroke intervention. Even with an NIHSS of greater than 10, less than a third of patients end up with mechanical thrombectomy. Even with an NIHSS greater than 10, I didn't mention this, but many more patients got treated with thrombolytics than with mechanical thrombectomy. So it was about double. So even in these bigger strokes, you end up with more treatments with thrombolysis. So if you're going to bypass a closer hospital, you're potentially doing a risk to the patients that don't end up with a large vessel occlusion. And overall, on the bottom line, about 6.6% of patients that EMS suspected strokes ended up with mechanical thrombectomy, but about 20.8% got thrombolytics. To me, what this indicates is both groups of patients are important. You cannot ignore the time to treatment for the thrombolytic patients at the expense of trying to select out the large vessel occlusion patients. Next slide. So Next is, I want to make the argument that if everyone treats and transfers quickly, you can just take them to the closest hospital for treatment and potentially save time on the evaluation, and also be a lot easier because it takes a lot to train up paramedics to become stroke neurologists. And given the fact that I just pointed out that even stroke neurologists don't make a very good decision, it probably makes more sense to focus on some other things. This isn't necessarily popular or out there, but I think the data suggests it's true. Next. So this was a report or a modeling study that I thought was super interesting that they did for California. It was published from the University of Calgary with basically the engineering department. And they said, we ought to be able to figure out, depending on the frequency of the stroke and your door to needle time and drive times based on Google Maps, where the patient would do best. And the bottom line was that if you had a fast door to needle and fast door in, door out, there was essentially no advantage to bypassing the closest hospital to take them to a thrombectomy center, even if the hospitals were fairly close to each other. Now, it's just a modeling study. Next slide. So we were waiting for this one, which was the RaceCat study, which looked at the effect. It really studied this quite well, the effect of direct transportation to a thrombectomy capable center versus a local stroke center, and what the ultimate outcome on neurologic outcome was on patients. Did it make any difference? Next. So RaceCat stands for RACE, which is the RACE scale for selecting patients with large vessel occlusion, which is one of the more commonly used ones. In Catalonia, that's where the cat came from. And the study population was if the paramedics or EMS found a patient with a RACE score of 5 to 9, in other words, more likely to have a large vessel occlusion, they randomized to take some of them to the thrombectomy center and about half of them to the closest local stroke center. And the map is of Catalonia, and yellow is the thrombectomy center, or yellow is the circles are the thrombectomy capable centers, and yellow squares are the primary stroke centers. And then you've got some telestroke centers and so on. So it kind of looks a little bit like California in terms of how we've got kind of urban areas that have the thrombectomy centers and somewhat more suburban and rural centers. Next. And bottom line, there was no difference. So it didn't matter whether you took the patient to the local center versus the thrombectomy center. So if you've got a patient that has a high RACE score, you take them to the closest center. They did just as well as if they, and then treated them and then transferred. They did just as well as if you tried to figure out where that they had a large stroke and bypassed the closest hospital. Next. And this is a plot that tried to look at subgroups. And there were basically no subgroup differences. So if this RACE score was even higher, it didn't matter. If they were eligible for thrombolysis, it didn't matter. Gender didn't make a difference. Age didn't make a difference. Basically, there was no difference where you took the patient. They did equally well regardless. Next. Now, there has been one issue that is important to point out as kind of making my point here. This was a very high performing area. The door to needle time at the thrombectomy centers was 30 minutes average, and at the primary stroke centers was 33 minutes. This is a high performing system. The other thing is the time from arrival to discharge, the door in, door out time was 78 minutes. Also very high performing. So in order to get those kind of numbers, if you can perform this way, then you can make a system where you take the patient to the closest hospital, you treat them quickly, and you transfer quickly. And we know that you see no decline in performance. That doesn't matter if you try to figure out to take them to the thrombectomy center. My argument is this is what we should strive for in California. We should strive for Catalonia style stroke performance at every facility because it certainly improves the care for everybody. Next. because walk-in patients need love too. About half the stroke patients walk in, fewer of them with severe strokes and large vessel occlusions, but not zero. There's been people walking in with major strokes and ended up needing treatment. And all these people need rapid transfer, rapid treatment and transfer as well. So if you're just focusing on a bypass and you can't juice up your treatment and transfer, you're missing half your population potentially. Next. So here's my wish list for better stroke systems. I would really, really, really like all EMS providers to get an accurate last known well time. What I find is that when I'm seeing these people, you know, it's really tough if we don't have an accurate last known well time. And unfortunately, I can't always rely on the EMS. I wish I could. They were there, they were talking to the family, they got the situation, but it's pretty frustrating to get a time and then check with the family and find out that actually that was the time that they were discovered. I'd like to get a reliable phone number for the family, even when the family is driving. I think most people have cell phones, and I can't tell you how many times I'm trying to verify the last known well or trying to figure out whether they were on meds that are a contraindication. I've had people go out to look for them in the parking lot. So that would be super helpful. And a reliable medication list. We get a lot of non-members. The electronic medical record is a godsend when it works, but if it doesn't, you really need to verify whether these patients are candidates for thrombolysis because of what their medications are. Can be a contraindication. If someone's on a, on a novel oral anticoagulant, we can't give it. If somebody is on warfarin, we can't treat them until after you get the INR back. I think that we should really have a statewide initiative, if not local, to minimize scene time, because we know that if we can get them quickly, they do better. And I would argue that any extra screening beyond suspecting an acute stroke doesn't help, and in fact would hurt if it adds any time to it at all. I know that it's a big deal. Los Angeles County, for example, does this screening and does a bypass based on the score. But the data would suggest if we can get to high performance, it makes more sense to bring them in really fast. EMS could bring patients to the closest hospital that can treat with thrombolytics, but if that's the case, I would argue that we should really hold hospitals to do it in less than 30 minutes. We've demonstrated that it's possible. There's literature out there. I'm happy to talk to anybody that wants to know how to get to less than 30 because it is doable. I'd love to have all hospitals able to do fast CT angiogram. I know we're blessed by having neuroradiologists, you know, read our films, but there is technology out there using artificial intelligence that allows you to get a, you know, fast CTA reading with a pretty high degree of reliability, even if you're not a neuroradiologist. And here's where I'd really like to work on, which is to get that door in, door out to less than 75 minutes, because that matches sort of Catalonia performance. Now, the problem that we have is transportation. And door in, door out is reliant on what type of medication you gave. If you give TPA, tissue plasminogen activator, also known as Actiplace, you need to use a critical care transport because they're running a drip. And pretty much everywhere in California, except I think Orange County, requires that you have critical care transport. You can apply to the state for a waiver to not have to have critical care transport, to have your paramedic rigs transport with the drip, but that's a heavy lift for a lot of EMS agencies. And when you talk to EMS agency directors, a lot of what they have to say is, you know, gosh, it's going to be something where we're going to spend a lot of time training to run this drip. There's pump issues, and then, you know, how do they keep their competence when they're transporting these people pretty rarely? I showed you that in 13,000 suspected stroke patients, you know, where 800 of them had large vessel occlusions that ended up with getting transferred. So what can you, well, so we switched to Tenecteplase for this reason about 1.5 years ago. Tenecteplase is off-label, but a lot of systems are switching because it's a lot easier. Then you're not reliant on a critical care transport rig. You can use ALS or 911 depending on where you're going. But I think we really ought to make a push to get this number down. And if it requires critical care, then we need those providers to step up to the plate. I'd like to get metrics. It's now a heart association metric to report door in, door out. I think we should be sharing that between hospitals and sharing ways that we can improve that. The way we do it in our system is when we see a patient in the emergency room that the teleneurologist thinks likely has a large vessel occlusion, that there's a good chance of it, we actually order the ambulance when they hit the door, before we get a CAT scan, before they get a CT angiogram, before they get thrombolysis. We see them in the doorway. We say, looks like it may well be a large vessel occlusion. Can you please order an ambulance? And we can always call them off better than we can get them, but we've been doing that because our goal is 75 minutes or less door to needle. The other thing you need in your system is you need the rapid acceptance, and I misspelled it, there are door to groin at all thrombectomy centers, so that if you're seeing a hospital that doesn't have thrombectomy capability, and it's impossible that they all will, there just aren't enough cases or expertise, but if you're seeing somebody at a hospital that's able to treat this patient with thrombolysis but not thrombectomy, then they need a really easy way to make that transfer. You need to be able to pick up the phone, get a hold of somebody to say yes, and then once they get to that facility, they need to have a really fast time to treatment. That they should, by all rights, they've had time to get ready, and so usually the time to successful revascularization is lower with transfer in patients than with patients that show up at your facility. And the reason that that's the case is they've had time to get the team together. But if it takes a while to assemble a team, I've heard, I've talked to some thrombectomy places, and if you're after hours, it takes, 20 minutes just to get somebody on the phone to say yes, and then it takes longer to get them treated. That's a problem. So we really need to focus on what can be done to streamline that. But if we could do all of these things, then we can basically all go out and have a sangria because we become Catalonia. Next. So thank you.
Well, thank you, Jeff. And I see that Nirali has not yet joined us. She had a patient that started at 4 o'clock today. But I'm sure that many of us have questions. I'd like to just ask you something based on your international background there. I know when we first met, we were talking about the 20-minute door-to-needle challenge from Helsinki. Could you update us a little bit about what's going on globally? You're talking about the Catalonian model now. And here's our chairman with the next question after that.
So what's going on internationally is very interesting. A lot of people have pushed for faster performance, and so you'll see reports about how it can be exported and how, and we've actually seen it in our area. Many more facilities are able to do that, and so I don't think 30 minutes is an unreasonable number anywhere, and there's a lot of places have been able to report. And if we've got a hospital that's saying they're struggling to hit 60 minutes or struggling to hit 45, there's proven ways to make that happen. Funny you should mention New Zealand, which is the background here. Had quite a chat with the person that runs the stroke network in New Zealand a few years ago, back when you could actually talk to people in person. And what they had reported was that they were having better performance after hours in treating stroke patients than they were in hours. In hours was basically during the daytime hours, and they did better after hours. And the reason they did better after hours is after hours, they had a teleneurologist that ran their stroke alert. In hours, they didn't. And I said, well, we run this teleneurologist all hours, because for me to run down from the office to the emergency room, by then, under our current system, the thing's already been treated. Why don't you just do it during the day. And they said, well, they were a little concerned that the National Health Service or whatever the New Zealand equivalent would think they didn't need as many neurologists. So I thought that was kind of an interesting answer. But they did better after hours than in hours because of the teleneurologist. So the other thing that's going on around the world is this potential shift to TNK. So tenecteplase, or TNK, is a genetically modified version of TPA. TPA is FDA approved to treat stroke. TNK is not yet, but a lot of places, I think it maybe started in Australia, but a lot of places had switched to TNK because it's a quicker, actually faster to give. We find that the pharmacy is able to mix it and deliver it faster. You don't have the pump issues, and it allows you to transfer a lot quicker. In some places, you're allowed, what'll happen with actually one of the reasons they do well in Catalonia is the ambulance will wait at the door after they bring the stroke patient in until they figure out if the patient needs to be transferred. But they're able to transport with a pump. We can't do that here, but if you use TNK, that becomes mute. And that idea that you can really optimize that system. I'd love to have a system where the ambulance comes, they bring the stroke patient, they wait, you treat them, and then they're out the door, because that would really help with this ability to transfer quickly. And the only problem is there's a fair number of patients that are brought in compared to the number that go. But if you're treating them in 30 minutes, they're not hanging out for all that long to find out. So that'd be another way to approach it. It's what some countries do.
Thank you. So in California, how ubiquitous has been the adoption of this shift in thrombolytics?
That's a good question. I know, well, I think we were the first large group in the state to move to tenecteplase. There was a large group, pretty large group, not as large as ours in Texas, that had moved before, but I was actually collecting a bunch of folks. Mai, do you know if there's been other large groups in California? I know we were approached by the folks at the Harvard system about our experience with it, but I'm not sure who all has changed. Maybe mine is.
No, I haven't kept up with the rest of the country. We were the second group after Ascension, Texas group that switched to TNKs or tenecteplase. Providence group was right after us. They were working on it, and they started implementing it. I think they have like a 55 hospital system. And yeah, Western Massachusetts was working on it, but I'm not sure if they've actually implemented it.
Yeah, I think they've done it in New South Wales, across the country, but in terms of California, I'm not really sure I have an answer for you.
Bill, did you have a question or ILS?
First of all, a comment, you're sort of paralleling what we've done for acute myocardial infarctions, which over the last several decades, we've worked hard to go from 120 minutes to 90 minutes door to balloon time to now we're all aiming to get under 60 minutes for door to balloon time. And then now we're working on door time from first contact to balloon time when the vessel is open. So I congratulate you on following that progress. It takes time to go through each of these little nuances, and protocols have to be developed in each hospital. Single calls, so you're not waiting for someone to answer and say yes or no, and waiting times, etc. One of the things as we approach, let's say, protocols or recommendations for the state of California, when the EMS arrives at a stroke patient, are there instructions to put the individual immediately in the ambulance and start the IV there in the ambulance? Or do they feel that they have to stabilize the patient, measure blood pressures on site, start IVs, get oxygen, all of that? Because that can be a 5 to 15 minute wait easily before they're actually on a transport vehicle at that time. So is there, what are your recommendations when you, for EMS, when they arrive at a stroke, how much time for stabilization, talking with the patients versus, what we used to call drip and ship, try to pick up the patient, which is done in the military, where you just go out there, you grab the patient and get them in transport and then deal with the stabilization.
Yeah, it's a great question, and I don't know the answer. I know a little bit about Contra Costa, where they were reporting their scene times of 15 minutes, which is really quite good. So they do look at a scene time, but what actually happens there, I'm not sure that it's standardized, other than, the scene time where they wanted to be 15 minutes or less. That sounds long to me, given what we just learned about the golden hour. Furthermore, there isn't usually a lot of medical stabilization for most stroke patients. So if your vitals look okay, you might want to just, go. It's nice if they have a IV in, because they're going to need an IV for treatment. But I would really prefer if they could, like I said, there's only a few pieces of information. I really care much more about the time last known well than the specifics of the diagnosis of the findings on the exam. It's also going to be, I don't know that there's any state standard. I think it's going to be like it always is with EMS, which is it depends on the agency. So the problem is we deal with 13 different EMS agencies, and so each one of them has their own protocols and governance. I think it'd be great if we could come up with some kind of a state standard on stroke about exactly what you do. Because I do believe that if you can come up with sort of the minimal steps and standardize it, that's one of the things we did when we did Stroke Express and cut out a bunch of steps that were not added value. And it was quite an interesting discussion. It's like, well, we need to get the lab results back. And we were having this discussion saying, well, tell me how many times in the last, hundreds of patients you've treated where there was an unusual lab that would have precluded you from doing it. Nobody could think of any. It's like, okay, we're not waiting for labs. And we have this argument, well, we're not going to room the patient because it takes 15 minutes to room, which gets to your idea. We're going to do them in the hallway. Well, we've never done it that way before. Yeah, well, what's the goal of, that? And then the big fight was, well, we're going to treat them in the CT scanner. And oh my goodness, we can't possibly treat them in the CT scanner. It's not a controlled environment. It's like, well, what do you expect to go wrong right after you put this drug in their arm? What tell me. So there's these things that we can't possibly until you start asking the question, right? Well, why do you need to do this? So I think that's a big point. Now, hadn't had the golden hour variability until, February when we looked at it. And I think you make an excellent point, which is let's look at it from the start to the finish and really make that point to, improve all those areas. Then we can achieve some of the things Cardiology is always years ahead of us in terms of, we're even stealing your drugs for crying out loud. To treat these people. And I think it's mostly because we never thought of doing therapy in neurology until more recently. But I think you're dead on. Just, can we minimize that time as well as everything else?
Now, the other thing is, when a patient comes in, you have to get a CT scan, at least for a stroke. And then in your case, a CT angio to see if it's a large vessel. So that has to work quickly. Then you have to be able to transfer quickly. I would presume it's faster to transfer a patient in the Kaiser system than for many of our hospitals that would be transferring to a embolectomy center that is out of their system, because then it's a little bit more different. To do that, what we've had to do in cardiology is have preset agreements ahead of time between the hospitals that they will automatically accept a patient. These have to be initiated. Sometimes it takes a year to get both hospitals to sign off. That the agreement is there. As soon as that patient needs to be transferred, it happens rather than we'll check and see if we have beds. We'll check and see what the patient's reimbursement or coverage is. We'll get back to you, et cetera. Because those transfers between non-affiliated hospitals take an additional period of time. And every one of these 15-minute chunks costs brain tissue at that individual. So it's very important to work those out. The last thing in cardiology that we've addressed is we've, in many hospitals, had to have our interventionalists to reduce door to balloon time sleep in the hospital on weekends and holidays so that they're immediately available. When that patient comes in, they'll get a call and they're just walking downstairs and meeting the team, which saves typically, in many cases, a 30-minute time to drive in by the interventionalist.
Yeah, so there's some interesting point. The agreement I totally agree with. We use some non-KP facilities depending on where the location is for the transfer. And we essentially insisted that we get a one call. We don't want to be waiting around. Right. And that they say yes. And actually, one of the things is if you are a comprehensive stroke center, you're required to say yes without a bed check. So that helped a lot. The regulations around that are to say yes. You mentioned the CT. One of the things people have done to try and speed the time is this mobile stroke unit idea. So you actually put the CAT scan in the back of the ambulance, which is fascinating, and they're really cool to look at, but I don't know how practical they are because you've only got one. And as far as I can tell, strokes never come one at a time. Remember, I'm covering 21 hospitals. As far as I can tell, there's some unwritten law that they only come two at a time because you never deal with just one. And so I don't know how that ambulance works. The other thing with the ambulance is the numbers have typically been pretty limited. How many they're actually able to treat, and sometimes for cost saving reasons, they'll only run during daytime hours. And there's only, I think, one in the country that was not funded by some philanthropy because they're very expensive to buy and run. My thing is, if you've got all these hospitals around with CAT scanners, why not just go to the closest hospital rather than trying to figure it out, sending the ambulance rig out? But maybe that'll happen. But you're right about the thing. Now, as far as the number sleeping in the hospital, the problem is the volume is quite a bit less than it is for cardiology. So we do, in Northern California, Kaiser, with 4.3 million members, we do about 300 thrombectomies a year. So it's just not as often as it is for cardiac. So that's just yet another thing to think about. But the transfer thing is really, it's doable. And I think you're hit the nail on the head, which is those need to be hammered out potentially with the aid of your EMS, because they can make things happen with these transfers, can really facilitate that. And I see Dr. Vora has arrived.
And she's just coming off of treating a patient. So I think she might be a little bit more delayed. So we have time for this one question, which is that somebody is asking for further information, possibly a reference article about the New Zealand example that you mentioned about the importance of teleneurology to reduce door-to-needle time. If you could just comment on that. And then
so
Nirali Vora will be unmuting herself when it's convenient.
Let me see if I can dig that up. It was actually a presentation at a stroke meeting, and I'll have to find out if it got published. We did publish, though, our system with teleneurology. We published about how we were able to dramatically improve our door-to-needle time once we instituted the telestroke program. That was published in Stroke in 2018, I believe. So I'll put both those references. Can I send them to you? I don't think I can stick them in the chat. I can stick one in the chat. The other I'll have to look for.
Email is preferable, I think.
Okay.
Jenny can just chat that out to the whole group. But we do have Dr. Vora joining us from Stanford now. I think she's She's
Hi, yeah, sorry everyone that I'm late. I was doing some patient care and great to see you, Jeff. I missed most of your presentation, but I just feel like I'm on edge in the golden hour all the time. So I'm always inspired by what you are all doing at Kaiser, and I got to see your slides, and always exciting to see how things are progressing. So shall I move into my section? Yeah. So as you all know, May is Stroke Awareness Month, and it's really exciting to be able to think about exactly what Jeff is talking about, which is how do we get patients into our systems that work so well faster, right? We've done a great job once you enter our system of care to give you treatment in the golden hour. But, you know, what about getting patients to that treatment system? And there are definitely issues with mobile stroke units. There are great options in certain cases, and we're going to learn more about that in a later Right Care Initiative meeting this summer. But it really comes down to, are patients going to call emergency when do they recognize the signs and symptoms of stroke? And actually, before I launch into my point, Jeff or Mai, hi Mai, what are you guys doing to raise awareness among your members about stroke? And recognizing when to call for emergency. Any new initiatives there?
So, I mean, it gets presented all the time at the farmers markets. Of course, those have gone away with pandemic. We've sort of tried to, you know, get the message out. It's been a real challenge. I mean, I was working with the Heart Association in Alameda, Contra Costa a couple of years ago, where we're really talking about we need to get this message out. But it's been a tough lift because even though the AHA has really been on this and, you know, touting it and, you know, really pushing for it, it's hard to get people to move. And it is, you know, there's actually disparities in this as well about who will call 911. I think one of the problems that was an eye opener to me is that people with less money may have been more reluctant to call because they're worried they're going to get stuck with a bill. That was an eye opener for me. So I'm open to suggestions because it has been a real challenge to get people to call. And, you know, they'll drive in, they'll wait for it to get better. I think the big problem is the organ that's having the stroke is the one that's impaired. And so you're relying on the family to recognize it. And that's probably the majority of where the calls come from, is the family. We had a discussion that we should really get the education out to the public schools so that the kids can call when grandma, you know, has her problem. I think there's a lot of interesting ideas, but, you know, I'm open to suggestions for that.
Yeah, anything to add, Mai?
No, except to say we haven't tried anything new. But I think I agree with Jeff. There are many different approaches that we need to figure out how people learn. People would learn differently, and which way they take in the information and the education. And sometimes it is there's cultural aspects behind it, social aspects behind it. It varies quite a bit. You know, most of our stroke patients are older, so getting the information to them may not necessarily just directly to the patient, but perhaps to family and, you know, which members, and that kind of depends sometimes on their social cultural structure.
So I couldn't have set this up any better. You guys outlined exactly why we need a fresh approach, and I'm really excited. I've been working with a group called Mission Thrombectomy 2020. They're a global group of primarily neurointerventionalists for stroke, but also stroke neurologists like myself. And you guys know I'm interested in global health too. To really think about how to get the word out. Their mission is really to think about how to improve mechanical thrombectomy all around the world. But as part of that, we need to, it doesn't matter what the end game is. The first step is entering the system and having the community, all ages. I really like what was said about younger ages, really being aware of the Be Fast stroke symptoms to be able to engage and call for their families to get into the healthcare system where we have amazing treatments that really work. And so we're doing this campaign called the #BeFastChallenge, and it originated actually as Salsa Against Stroke, and really thinking about using dance and videos and the current social media culture among everyone, but especially youth, to get something going that's viral, have fun, and actually will allow for cultural adaptation and tailoring. And that's why we went from salsa against stroke to just Be Fast Dance Challenge, because we're finding that people all over the world have their own ways to express through art the Be Fast symptoms. And I want to share with you my screen and encourage all of you, Kaiser, the whole, every system to take part. And were you doing it kind of like the, the ALS Ice Bucket Challenge, where you can call out people and challenge them, and hopefully everyone can kind of promote this together. And so I've been sharing this in like every venue I've been speaking. And I'm going to play, this is from a colleague in Colombia, Medellin, Colombia. So their salsa is really good. It doesn't have to be this good, but I'm realizing.
And let's encourage everybody to get up and move while they
walk. You guys can dance to this. I realized I might not be sharing my audio, so give me 1 second to make sure that I am sharing the sound. Okay, let me start again. Thumbs up. Wait, are you guys hearing the sound? Yes. Okay, thanks.
Great.
Oh, no. Okay, we're starting over. Okay, move and see if you can see the feedback, okay? What's going on? Okay, eyes. Facial drooping. Arm drip or leg. And this is global, so call emergency and say 911 for any country. All right. And so I think you can have a lot of fun with it. It's, for Twitter or whatever, TikTok, it's like a minute and something seconds. And I think that, like what was said, the community really needs to kind of help each other and educate. And I totally agree with other, how do we educate in the school system? How do we get youth involved? And how do we spread this message? Because they're the ones that are often going to be calling, not the patient themselves. So I just wanted to share that. I think it's really fun. I think you can have a lot of fun with it, and encourage you all to take part in the challenge and just add that hashtag so we can track it and promote it if you see others doing it. I'll put the website in the chat box after I'm done here.
And Nerali, your narration of the video was really helpful. And I think you should overlay it with that, because when I first saw the video, I didn't really understand the relationship with stroke. So your overlay was super helpful. I don't know whether you can consider that for other Be Fast Dance Challenge videos.
Thank you, Hattie. So Jeff, am I going to see you dancing?
I already texted Mai that we need to get Divya on it. Divya is our dance person. So
there you go. You could do, Bollywood.
She did get an entire room of neurologists up at an academy meeting dancing once after her presentation. So if she can do that, she can get anybody to dance.
Awesome. There you go. So encourage everyone, like you said, what we've been doing for a decade with FAST, we need to do better. So we need to try something different. Be fast. Okay. That's all I had. Go ahead, Hattie.
So Steve Sidney, I would love to have you come on to your video and unmute yourself. I'll just go ahead and introduce the wonderful Steve Sidney, who is the Director of Research Clinics for Kaiser Permanente Northern California Division of Research. And the way that we've really connected is around the National Forum for Heart Attack and Stroke Prevention, and also around the Cardia study. There's Steve. So Steve is sort of a superhero in the right care world. He has done so many great things for improving health outcomes that his legacy is absolutely amazing in starting the Cardia study back in the early 1980s. And from that study, we now know that there is this subclinical atherosclerosis that's driving these strokes and heart attacks among 1 in 20 women have subclinical atherosclerosis by age 45, 1 in 7 men. Steve Sidney is a very famous author, having co-authored more than 500 peer-reviewed scientific publications. And he is our 2019 Right Care Initiative Lifetime Achievement Award winner. His work has been funded by the National Institutes of Health, and he is a graduate of many fine programs, including his wonderful basic original work in mathematics at Yale University. He went on to get a medical degree from Stanford, Nirali's home base now, and his master's at our own UC Berkeley School of Public Health. So Steve, thank you so much for your leadership over the years and being part of our strategic team, and for inviting Dr. Mai Nguyen-Huynh, who you will be introducing. So with that, the floor is yours, Steve. Next slide, please.
Thank you, Hattie, and you always kind of overstate who I am, I think, but much appreciated. So I'm going to do two things. I have about, probably take me about 10 minutes to go through some slides here. A lot of this is not going to be news to a lot of people. I hope everybody gets maybe a little bit out of it, but I want to talk some things about strokes and hypertension, trends in them, and why this important, the study that Mai will describe, that was an intervention towards Black adults with uncontrolled hypertension, is so important. So if we could have the next slide, please. So basically, again, I said this is going to be really elementary for a lot of folks. There are 3 types of stroke: ischemic intracerebral hemorrhage, subarachnoid hemorrhage. Ischemic stroke's the most common stroke in older adults. It's the 5th leading cause of mortality in the United States. In 2020, there were more than 160,000 deaths from stroke. And importantly, 85% of stroke deaths occur in those who are 65 years and older. And there's a very old estimate that the American Heart Association carries of 795,000 new strokes in the US annually. I think for more current data, it's going to be more than that, but that's the one they're carrying right now. Next slide. So this is a slide showing mortality rate changes from 2000 to 2020. And the important thing to note here, it was going down at quite a precipitous rate starting in 2000 until about 2011 to 2010 to 2012, down about 40%. And it's basically puttered around there since then, with a blip upward during the COVID year of 2020. Next slide, please. This is looking at it by race ethnicity, and the big point is that line at the top, which is the stroke mortality rate in Black persons, is way, way higher than all the others. Way, way higher. Next slide. And this shows the number of strokes, which interestingly was going down till that same point in time that the rate was going down, around 2010 to 2012, but has gone up since then. And the question is, how can the rate be about the same, but the number of deaths going up more than can be accounted by population growth? And that is answered on the next slide here, which is the population change from 2010 to 2020. Overall, 6.7% population change, tiny population change in the under 65-year age group, enormous 38% population change from about 40 million to about 55 million in the over 65 age group. So this age group, even though it accounts for only 1 out of 6 people, actually accounts for 3/4 of the entire population growth from 2010 to 2020. And it's a scary number because it's still going up, and it speaks to the burden of what we have to deal with now and in the future, because the projection is it's just going to keep going up for quite a while. Next slide. Just for a little local color, I pulled off rates in Alameda County, which generally, similar pattern. They're actually a little bit higher in some places, but not in others. And they, went down to about 2013, 2014, and have generally been creeping up since then. And next slide, which is the number of strokes in Alameda County. And this shows that similar pattern. It came down until about 2013, 2014, and it's been generally increasing, albeit irregularly, since then. And next slide. So in the next few slides, I want to talk about hypertension, and it is the leading risk factor for ischemic stroke. Also an important risk factor for heart failure, ischemic heart disease, chronic renal failure, and dementia. Since 2017, the prevalence of hypertension has increased, actually at that time because of the guideline change from the JNC 7 to the ACC AHA guidelines, which lowered the systolic cut point from 140 to 130 and the diastolic from 80 to 80. In 2017 to 2018, when the change was made, the overall prevalence in the US population of hypertension in adults was an enormous 45.6%, more than 120 million adults. It's estimated to cost $131 million a year. And in 2020, hypertension was a primary or contributing cause of death for over 670,000 people, or about 20% of all deaths from all causes. So this is why we're talking about hypertension and stroke, because it's if you could knock out hypertension, you would way knock down the rate of stroke. So next, a few slides showing prevalence of hypertension. So this is another biggie. I mentioned before it was 45% overall prevalence, but it's again way higher in Black persons at about 55%, significantly higher than all the other race ethnicity groups. Next slide. This is the percent of US adults with controlled hypertension among those with hypertension. And this shows a rather disturbing recent pattern in that basically hypertension control increased a lot from the beginning of the century to about 2013, 2014, when it was at about 54%, not great, but a whole lot better than it is now, just 4 years later, with a recent estimate from N. Haynes of being 10 percentage points lower at 43.7%. So that's a 10 percentage point drop. Very, very concerning. Next slide. This is, another scary one for our story, where we look at the percentage of US adults with controlled hypertension by race ethnicity. And what you see here, much lower among those of Black persons, 38% versus 48% in whites. And as I think may have been mentioned, or I think Mai may mention, we see a differential, even though we have very high control rates in Kaiser Permanente. That differential exists. There's a difference between white persons and Black persons. And the next slide. And I think this is the last one here, which shows the same pattern as the blood pressure control among adults, but this is looking at those taking antihypertensive medication. And the percentages are higher than the earlier one I showed you, but they're not perfect, and they dropped also in the last 4 years. So I think that was my last slide there. And the message from these slides is that is a segue into Mai's talk, that first of all, we have a big problem with stroke in this country. It's much worse in Black people. And we have a big problem with hypertension, much worse in Black people. Big problem with hypertension control in those who have hypertension, much bigger in Black persons than in others. Who will about to talk research, I have a little more information than her. She received her undergraduate training at Harvard, medical school training at Stanford, and then did her residency, her neurology residency training in Boston. Then came out to UCSF and resided at UCSF as a stroke neurologist until about 2011, when between Jeff and partially myself, she was persuaded to come over to Kaiser Permanente, where we're delighted to have her. And she has basically 50% neurologist, though I think she probably works about 120% on that, and 50% research position. And as you can see, she's a research scientist with our division, and also the regional Northern California Regional Medical Director for Primary Stroke and Chief of Neurology for the Diablo service area. And very much, as I think you've probably heard, but I wasn't around for the beginning, very much involved in the development of the program that Jeff described. So and we met while she was at UCSF. In about 2012, we applied and received an award from National Institute of Neurological Disorders and Stroke for a stroke prevention program, which included 5 projects. And Mai designed the one you're about to hear about, Shake, Rattle, and Roll. So Mai, off to you.
Thank you, Steve, for that introduction. Yes, we go way back. And actually, my interest in this whole thing that leads to the Shake, Rattle, and Roll study started before I joined Kaiser officially. And that was when Steve, Clay Johnson, and I used to partner up and say, look at blood pressure control. So I have a great interest because as Steve presented to you, it is basically the #1 risk factor for stroke and the #1 modifiable risk factor for a lot of other conditions. And why is it that we've had medications for this condition for more than, I don't know, 50 years? I got to track back to see when the first time we have, blood pressure medication available, but it's been more than 50 years, and we still can't get this thing under control. And not only that, we continue to see a lot of disparities in how the blood pressure is being controlled. And I naively back then thought that, well, Kaiser is a system of care where members should have access to care, right? They all have equal access to care. So that was one of the proposed explanations for possibly not being able to have access to care or access to medications, et cetera, to get blood pressure under control. So I first started looking at that angle within Kaiser to see what the blood pressure control was like in the system where you should be able to get appointments and pharmacy coverage. Okay, here we go. Next slide, please. Okay, just really quick, very quick background. So these are all the Kaiser Permanente groups in the country, and I'm focusing on the Northern California region only. But as you can see, we are the second biggest after Southern California for all of Kaiser's region. Next slide. And so Jeff kind of showed you something similar like this earlier. Geographically, we're quite a bit spread out in Northern California. We have 21 hospitals, and all 21 are Joint Commission certified stroke centers, and over 4.5 million members, with about, well, probably more than 9,500 physicians by now. Next slide. So the following slides I'm going to share with you actually just give you the background of the hypertension program in Kaiser. It started in 2000, actually was the initial part of rolling out a big effort. Back then in 2000, Kaiser's rate of blood pressure control was actually lower than national HMO. And there are many thoughts about why that is, or why that was. But the whole thing pushed Kaiser into standardizing a program, an approach for everybody for blood pressure control. The Hypertension Registry was created, and as you can see over the years from 2000 to 2018, blood pressure control started to rise up. That's the blue line, by the way, for Kaiser. Start to rise up consistently. Next slide. So in prior publications, and the program was co-led by Mark Jaffe and Joe Young, they identified the key elements that made up the success of this hypertension program in the last, 18 years or so when they reported it. So the key was creating a hypertension registry with validated, connected, in a comprehensive electronic medical record system, coming up with a treatment algorithm that's standardized so everyone can actually refer to something. And it is based on evidence-based guidelines, making it simple, making it implementable. Go into the clinic and actually tracking the data so that you're tracking the data at a system level, but also getting down to the clinic level and even getting down to the clinician level and providing that data, being transparent about it, so that you can drive improvement efforts. Having the blood pressure measurement clinics be accessible and free. Medical assistants were trained to help measure the blood pressure. And then pharmacists were actually trained to help, based on the treatment algorithm, adjust the medications as needed. And the addition of the single pill combination therapy at this time was also quite key because it makes it much easier to treat these patients. Most patients with hypertension require more than one medication to get under control. And the single pill combination also became generic, and that makes it also a lot cheaper to deliver this care. Next slide. So with that great program, the improving of the hypertension control was then also linked to a fall in the cardiovascular morbidity and mortality in Kaiser, as well as a reduction of mortality from stroke. And so when you have a successful program like that that's linked to a great outcome, then you say, great, how can we make this any better? Next slide. I actually talked about most of these, so we can skip over this slide. So at the time when Steve and I looked at hypertension control rate in Kaiser, as Steve described, even though we were doing so well, we were hitting this 85% range of blood pressure control. There was a clear difference between Black patients and white patients. And that you can see. So the blue line is for the white patient, rate blood pressure control for the white patients over the years. And the orange red line is for Black patients. And this disparity or this difference consistently goes throughout the years, no matter how well we do with the overall program. And that was our challenge to ourselves, is how to narrow that gap. Next slide. Keep going. Yep. So come when we have the opportunity to apply for NIH funding to create an intervention to reduce disparity in stroke, we took a few steps back. And so we didn't actually focus on stroke patients per se. We focused on primary prevention, targeting that blood pressure control And we thought this is such a big, important risk factor. If we can even narrow the gap of this one, we might be able to do a lot of good for prevention of stroke down the line. So our primary research question at the time was, could we create an intervention of either diet or lifestyle coaching, or intensified our pharmacotherapy protocols some more, in addition to the usual care? Would any of that work better than usual care to improve the blood pressure control rate? And as you saw, the gap was somewhere around 5% between Black patients and white patients. And we thought, well, if we can even improve the hypertension control rate in Blacks by another 4%, we can actually significantly narrow the gap. The estimate was then we would need about 200 patients in each of these intervention arms. Next slide. So Shake, Rattle, and Roll was born somewhere around 11 p.m. on a call night. This name came up. So it stood for Shake the Salt Habit, rattle the intensity of our pharmacotherapy protocol, and hopefully roll out the results. Slide. So really quickly, to explain why it says that Shake, Rattle, and Roll is a pragmatic cluster randomized control trial and why we chose to do that. Most conventional clinical trials are explanatory trials. They focus on a particular detail with very strict criteria on how things are done within that clinical trials, and very strict inclusion criteria and exclusion criteria for the patients to be enrolled. Pragmatic trials take a step back and take a look at the whole forest and not just a single tree or a single leaf. And we try to look at what is it like in the real world situation, with the goal that hopefully by the end of that study, it would be easier to implement the results. Sometime you probably realize that we have, great results from a clinical trial, and when you try to implement those clinical trials into real community settings, not so easy. Next slide. So this again, just to quickly emphasize that, explanatory trial really focus on the intervention under very specific conditions. And therefore it sometimes makes the implementation of the trial results more difficult. But a pragmatic trial doesn't go exactly to explain the mechanism under which the intervention may work, but it will help you learn about whether the intervention work at all and whether you can actually implement that in a real world setting. Next slide. Keep clicking through it, please. There you go. So we chose to do a pragmatic cluster randomized control trial. Next slide. Keep clicking a couple more. Okay. And what happened here is we created 3 arms for Shake, Rattle, and Roll. Usual care, enhanced monitoring, which is the pharmacotherapy arm, and the lifestyle coaching. After enrollment into the trial, the patients would then, actually, I think the previous slide missed something, which is that the primary care physicians were the one who got randomized into one of these 3 arms. So we had about 99, actually, primary care physicians in Oakland where the study took place. And we took those, everybody with a panel size of African-American patients were randomized into the 3 arms. And all of their patients in that panel would qualify to participate in the study. So those who got randomized into usual care, well, the study goes on for 12 months. And in the usual care, absolutely no patient contact. And our IRB determined that we did not have to consent in usual care. We sent a few questionnaires out to a random subset of usual care to collect some data, as well as a 24-hour urine sodium test, which I'll tell you more about later. In the 2 intervention arms, our IRB determined that we had to consent because these were not done at the time in our system. And again, each of the arms went for 12 months of intervention. And after the intervention ended, that was the end of our contact with the patients. They consented it. They also fill out questionnaires. They also, some of them, did the 24-hour urine test. Next slide. The inclusion criteria were actually fairly straightforward. Again, pragmatic trials don't tend to have a long list of inclusion exclusion criteria. So we took all Kaiser member with pharmacy benefits, which is over 98, close to 99%. Adults, age 18 and older, anyone who are collected, registered in the Hypertension Registry with a self-reported race of African American with sufficient understanding of the English language to participate in the program. And really on the exclusion side, we only excluded pregnant women, patients who would not be able to participate really in some of the coaching or part of the lifestyle arm due to either because they're in hospice or skilled nursing facility, board and care, etc. We also excluded patients who actually were diagnosed with diagnosis of dementia and a patient who was end-stage renal and on dialysis. Next slide. So this is the usual care. In Kaiser for the hypertension program, there's this pharmacotherapy protocol, which you actually can access online. I think if you search the FACE program, you might navigate a little bit, you'll find it. But it basically, you see that it's not meant for you to read every single word on here. It's just a flow chart of the antihypertensive medication that we use in the order that was recommended. So there's, the starting it out with the ACE and diuretic combo, and then moving on to the next step, etc. In this pathway, make a note that spironolactone is near the bottom of that, pathway of medication, which is one of the diuretics that's actually been shown to work better in Black patients for blood pressure control. So this is usual care. Next slide. In the enhanced pharmacotherapy arm, what happened was that we, in our preliminary data, found that, well, patients are supposed to come back every 2 weeks in order to get their blood pressure under control if the numbers are still high. But it doesn't always happen. And as a matter of fact, most of the time it did not happen in 2 weeks. So could we set up a system in which we can explore barriers to these things and help the patient make those appointments and help them, get reminders and coming back for the frequent checks as needed. And then also we had our study pharmacists who are actually clinical pharmacists at Oakland moved up the use of spironolactone and intensify it more on the protocol to address these patients who have persistent uncontrolled blood pressure rather than leaving it near the bottom. And then in the lifestyle arm, patients can participate in up to 16 individual phone counseling sessions with a lifestyle coach. And all of our staff in the whole study, didn't matter what they did, their roles were in the study. They were all trained in motivational interviewing methods and culturally appropriate approaches with the participants. So we were lucky, we partner with our, at the time it's called Regional Health Education Office. They have a new name now. And they really help us set up the booklet, which you'll see in a moment for the lifestyle arm, and also help train our staff and follow some of our lifestyle coaching sessions throughout the study. Next slide. So these are just snippet pictures of part of what our program booklet looked like for the lifestyle arm. We actually had a lot of materials. Some of the materials were just shared in print across all 3 arms, but not the lifestyle booklet. This was reserved only for the lifestyle arm. And so it lay out for them what the 16 sessions would be like. And you might notice in the table of content that basically session 1 through 8 include what we call the active sessions. So they have a clear topic listed there for each session. But after that, it's really just follow-up. So session 9 to 15 and then 16 is just a wrap-up. It's really up to the patient what they would like to rediscuss. Maybe they find that they have more difficulty with eating out and maintaining a better eating plan. So they will repeat that topic, later on. So next slide. For each of the sessions, it's usually involved that the coaches would get started with the information on whatever topic this is. This session 1 happened to be diving right into the DASH eating plan. And then at the end of the session, they usually try to set up goals for the next session. And if this was, say, session number 2, they would also have discussed, did I succeed in meeting my goals from the last session? And if I didn't, what happened? What were the barriers? And could we work from there? And the participants all knew going into this study with us that this is a 12-month thing. We have a shot at 12 months of trying to help them, coach them. And then at the end of 12 months, we hope they can stand on their own 2 feet and continue the teachings that that took place in the study. Next slide. So our primary outcome was really just looking at rate of blood pressure control at 12 months after the enrollment, or otherwise 12 months at the end of the intervention, right? So, and we chose this cutoff in time, one point of cutoff in time, mainly because of the NCQA HEDIS criteria and how they structure looking at blood pressure control rate. It was meaningful for our organization, or basically any organization that respond to the HEDIS metric. So we set it up to be an intention to treat analysis. That means all patients who were randomized into that arm, whether they finished the arm or not, that data would be analyzed with the original arm. And then in further addressing the blood pressure measurements, we then also looked at all blood pressure recorded during that time period that we're interested in, and not just a single cutoff point, which was defined as the primary outcome. Next slide. This is just to explain that we define our period of cut-off point with some leadway, plus or minus 3 months at the 12-month period. So we try to take the blood pressure measurement that is closest. So again, this is a pragmatic trial. We used our blood pressure measurements that were done in the primary outpatient setting. So could have been in a blood pressure clinic, could have been in a visit to that primary care doctor, and this was all available to us in the electronic medical record system. We took the closest blood pressure measurement to the 12-month cutoff that we were interested in. So we did not, like in a quote-unquote conventional trial, set a time where we say, at this 12-month time, you have to come back for a visit, and we would get your blood pressure, et cetera, and that would be the final outcome. Nope, we let it happen the way that it would normally happen in clinical care for us in our system, and use those measurements. Next slide. So this is just a study flow diagram showing you how these patients enter the study. Basically, as I mentioned, primary care physicians get randomized into the 3 arms along with their panel of patients, and then the patients in the intervention arms were approached or consented with the goal that we were trying to enroll at least 200 in each arm, and we did by the end of this study. Next slide. So looking at our baseline characteristics for the folks in the trial, they were all very similar. So that's great, because you want in a randomized trial for them to all look very similar, and nothing's really stood out different. Next slide. Keep going. Okay, so looking at our primary outcome at 12 months, so at the end of the 12 months of intervention, the rate of blood pressure control in lifestyle was 67.8%, and in usual care, 61.8%. So about 6% difference. Lifestyle did 6% different, better than usual care. That didn't quite meet statistical significance, as you see with a p-value of 0.07, but there was some suggestion there that they may have been better. Next slide. So what happened then when we follow, quote unquote, these patients electronically, because in our system, we can track all blood pressure measurement, whether they see us in the study or not, right? So if you remember, they did not see us, nor did we contact them after 12 months. We just continue to follow up on how they do as the months go out. So our secondary outcomes included 24 months after enrollment, so that's about 1 year after the end of the intervention, and then 48 months, which is about 3 years after the end of the intervention. And by this time at follow-up, as you can see, lifestyle continued to do better in terms of their rate of blood pressure control. And it's an 11%, 11.2% to be exact, better than usual care. And that's, at that point in time, definitely statistically significant. What surprised us was the 48 months, which is 3 years out from the end of the intervention. And you still see that lifestyle had a 73.1% rate of control and usual care 64.5. And so lifestyle is still significantly better. So the odds of having blood pressure control is 1.5 times that of usual care at 3 years' time. And I just want to mention also that if you wonder, since I presented the slide at the beginning, that the rate of blood pressure control in Kaiser at the time was running around 80, 85%. So how come these patients are so low? They're only 60, 70%. These are persistently uncontrolled patients. That was one of the criteria for them to be in the study, was that they continually having blood pressure numbers that are out of range. And so that's why in this population, it wasn't too surprising to us that harder to control, we can get them to even move the needle in the right direction, we would have made progress. Next slide. Other outcomes we looked at is that if a patient can achieve blood pressure control initially, they were more likely to achieve blood pressure control at the follow-up time, at 24 months and at 48 months post-enrollment. And that is absolutely true for the lifestyle arms. A lot more patients in the lifestyle arm were able to maintain that, what we call sustained blood pressure control at the 3 time points. Next slide. And then we looked at a whole bunch of other things. How do you explain this? How do you explain that lifestyle arm did better? Was it because they got more blood pressure medications? We didn't see that. Were they better at refilling their medication because they got the coaching? Didn't see that either, because we can track all of these across all arms. Was there anything different about the weight, their BMI, their self-reported physical activity? Or did they see their primary care doctor more often? Because if you have more interaction with your doctor, maybe you got some more interaction in terms of controlling your blood pressure or more coaching or whatever. We didn't see any differences across the arms in these areas. And another point to make was just that during the time frame, and it's only a 12-month intervention, but during the whole time frame of the study that we had these participants in, Kaiser Northern California didn't really make any significant changes to our hypertension control program. Next slide. So as I mentioned before, instead of that one cutoff blood pressure measurement at 12 months or 24 months or 48 months, we did some sensitivity analysis just to use all the measurements of blood pressure during this time and not just the one point in time. And even with those sensitivity analysis, the numbers may be a little bit different, but the message remained the same. So lifestyle arm was still coming out as having higher rate of blood pressure control and statistically significant compared to the usual care group and even to the enhanced group. Next slide. This is just to give you an idea. 16 sessions is a lot. And not all patients stick with us all the way to the end for 16 sessions. And again, really the goal for us was for them to attain the 8 active sessions, and actually for them to attend 6 was what we had originally put in our plan. Because the second half of the 8 session is really just the repetition of the prior topics. More than 50% of our patients were able to attend the first 8 sessions. Next slide. So I dropped this in because one of the objective, I guess, data point that we try to collect in the study was to see, because we focused so much on lifestyle coaching, and a big chunk of that had to do with the DASH eating plan and the lower sodium intake, how do you show that patients actually follow that and if they have lower sodium intake? Like we don't have any other ways of collecting that information. So we try to collect 24-hour urine sodium and at the beginning of the trial when they first started, and then at the end once they completed their 12-month intervention. This was not a favorite test of our participants, and that's to say mildly. Actually, most of them not interested, and we offer incentives or whatnot, not interested in doing this at all. As you can see, we were more successful with convincing the lifestyle participants to do it, and probably because they had that one-on-one interaction more with their coach to do that. And so we did see a change, a negative change or decrease of sodium intake in the lifestyle group that, you know, our clinician and expert in renal medicine or in hypertension would say that that looks significant. But to be honest, I can't say a whole lot about this number because we were unable to compare the lifestyle arm numbers to the other two arms. Next slide. This is again another sensitivity analysis that we did, taking into consideration all the blood pressure measurement over time and trying to see what those changes may be. And so each line represents each of the arms. The usual care is the solid line down at the bottom. And then enhanced monitoring is the dotted orange-ish looking line, also down at the bottom. Not too different from the usual care. If anything, may have gotten a little worse at the end of the 48 months. But the lifestyle coaching arm continued to improve in terms of their rate of blood pressure control in these trajectories. And, you know, the difference was quite significant. Next slide. So this is just showing you that the type of antihypertensive that we use by these patients. And essentially the message here is that we did not see a difference in the type of antihypertensive that were prescribed across these three arms. And again, nor did we see any difference in the number of medication or the refill rate across the arms. Next slide. We did try to look also at clinical outcomes. Now our intervention time was pretty short, it's only 12 months, but we did try to look at what happened at clinical outcomes at 24 months and at 48 months for mortality, ischemic stroke, and hemorrhagic stroke. And again, if you remember, these were not stroke patients. These were patients who did not have, we didn't select them for any history of stroke. This was a primary prevention effort. So we did not detect any differences in terms of clinical outcomes across the three arms. Next slide. Okay, so for some of the learnings that we got from our Shake, Rattle, and Roll, well, we wanted to prove a point. We wanted to prove that lifestyle coaching focused on the DASH eating plan, lowering your sodium intake, was gonna help reduce the blood pressure and help control it better. So we basically was able to do that in a population of patients who are probably motivated to pursue this, right? But we did realize from the get-go that the one-on-one coaching is not necessarily realistic in the long run if you wanted to do population-based medicine. But it helped us prove the point that this could be done, and therefore the learnings from which we took away from Shake, Rattle, and Roll was what kind of interactions, what kind of education was it that was really helpful to the patients and, you know, to the coaches. And we learned also that access to be able to have questions answered by these coaches was very important for the participants. The other thing we learned is that future efforts, we gotta figure out ways to enroll and to recruit and to help younger patients. So Shake, Rattle, and Roll was not as successful enrolling younger patients, so less than the age of 50. Our average age was about 65. So we did get a little bit more of an older population. So younger patients, busy life, on the go, you know, scheduling these one-on-one coaching session, again, probably not a realistic or a very good way of approaching them. So could we think more of some kind of group education or availability on, at their fingertips? Probably some kind of technology, apps, things where you can spread information and allow them to be able to ask questions and check on things at whatever time that they need, and not put into a schedule of classes. We also learned from surveys from our participants and the debriefing from our coaches is that the goal setting and the reevaluation of these goals and identifying those barriers were very helpful to our participants. Be able to set those goals and understand why I didn't meet them and what else could I do to do better next time. That whole process of sort of self-performance improvement was very crucial. We also learned that they appreciate even all the handouts and all the education materials that we had to understand the basic things like calorie counting, sodium numbers, and understand where their level is, and understand, basically what's an ideal physical activity time for somebody like me. And so all of those information really could be relayed in some way that makes it readily available to the patients, right? And we put in some group sessions. Initially, we thought we'd just do it, quarterly or every other month, and it was optional because we thought that was a way to just build sort of a community in the study so that the participants can get together. It turned out actually to be quite successful toward the end. As more and more people learn about it, more and more people came. And we had, our coaches did a great job. They presented these. They also got a lot of Kaiser swags for our participants. They also invited local celebrities to stop by, local chefs, to come and do some demonstrations of recipes, cooking demonstrations. Those were big hits, actually, and turned out to be very useful and enjoyable for our participants, not only because they got to go there and share their issues, barriers, successes with the other participants, but then they also got to have a little bit of fun and learning, some new recipes, etc. So we're going to have to, whatever we do next, we're going to have to keep in mind those kind of activities and things. And again, the culturally appropriate recipes, the time our coaches and health education office help us, put together these materials so that, they're not eating, Chinese fried rice and, things that are more appropriate for the African American communities. And even fitness and diet suggestions were, thought twice before we put it out there for them. Next slide. So just in summary, what did we see? We basically saw that in Shake, Rattle, and Roll, the lifestyle coaching intervention did better at every time point in terms of better rate of blood pressure control. May not have been statistically significant in the first 12 months that it was done, but it came out quite significant in the follow-up. And we saw no differences in the blood pressure control for that enhanced pharmacotherapy arm. I think we pushed it as much as we could push as far as pharmacotherapy goes, and as far as the absorption and intake from the patient side for that intervention. And so I think that with Shake, Rattle, and Roll, we basically were able to show that at least with a culturally appropriate coaching program, focusing on the DASH eating plan, that we could, in the right population, help these patients control their blood pressure better. And amazingly enough to us, they've been doing it 3 years out. I think I'm going to have to get some funding just to analyze to see what happened at 5 years to these patients, et cetera, because it'd be interesting and fascinating to see how long these folks can totally keep up and do it on their own. Next slide. Oh, the last couple of slides is just references for you. So the first one is the methods paper, where we publish about the rationale and the design behind the trial. And then the next slide is the results paper that just came out last week in JAMA Network. So these you can refer to for more details. The JAMA Network paper actually also have, I don't remember how many supplement sections we included with that one, Steve, but it had a lot of data and including the full study protocol, if you were interested. And with that, next slide. We always like to thank our study participants because otherwise we wouldn't get these great data and learnings and all the time that they spent on it. Next slide. And this was our original team for Shake, Rattle, Roll. It's changed since then. Thank you, everybody.
I'm wondering if you could bring back and talk about the outcome slide, because I thought I saw an important signal in the hemorrhagic stroke. Maybe it went by too fast.
Okay. Would you bring back the clinical outcome slide? Yeah.
So the period of time that you're looking at here, can you just discuss this slide a little bit more?
Sure. So the top part of the table is at 24 months after enrollment, which is about a year after the intervention ended. And then the bottom half is 48 months, that's the 3 years after the intervention ended. And so with this, I mean, nothing quite met statistical significance on any of the arms comparisons for any of the clinical outcomes. When you mentioned hemorrhagic, maybe were you thinking in the 24 months? Lifestyle had a 0.9%, usual care had a 0.3%. Comparing there is a 0.21 p-value.
I'm looking at the 0.1 for the enhanced monitoring at the 48 months. So maybe, are you able to look farther out? Because one would think.
Yes, so we would. I think if we're out of funding at this point, but we might try to apply for something to try and look at a little bit further out of the analysis. So as you see the 0.1 in the enhanced arm, if you compare lifestyle to enhanced, you know, that because the sample size is smaller for both of the intervention arms, the p-value didn't, you know, come close to being significant. It was a 0.25 when you compare lifestyle and enhanced arm. And I think it's because of sample size issue. We could try to look further out beyond that and see if we see anything else comes out at 5 years. That's why I said, you know, this was we were able to report 3 years that ended around 2018 to 2019. So we should now have 5-year data.
Thank you. You're so fortunate to have your wonderful electronic medical records. Go ahead, Dr. Yu from Palo Alto Medical Foundation.
Hi, thank you. This was a great presentation, Mai. I really admire your work. I'm curious that with this study, how has it informed Kaiser's approach in managing blood pressure for your population going forward? I appreciate your mention that lifestyle coaching is not scalable, but I would imagine these results must have informed.
At least not the one-on-one, but yeah, we're actually in active discussions right now. You know, I think everyone's been waiting for our publication to come out to make things official. But the idea of lifestyle coaching has been in Kaiser system. I don't know, maybe Jeff knows, for a long time. Even back when I joined, you know, almost every medical center has a health education office in their medical center. So the idea is there, and there are plenty of classes that are offered. However, nothing has been done systematically, okay, for patients, say, of hypertension, and especially those who have difficulty controlling their blood pressure. There hasn't been a systematic approach on how do you get the information in terms of lifestyle changes to those patients, and in which way, because if you just tell patients, and we know that printing paper handout, that's probably one of the lowest yield. And we have a DASH eating plan handout, by the way. but and we did hand that to our participants in the study. But with just that isn't going to go anywhere. No, not very far. And having the patient having to navigate by himself, like, what do I do with this? Even though it's lay out what the feeding plan is, how do I even know? And that's what we found out is even the basic things like, do you know how to count calories? Do you know how to look at reading labels? Do you know how to look at sodium count and therefore know what's bad, what's not bad? So we're just starting our conversation again now with the regional health program, and all of our now, since we started the study, there's a group within Kaiser called the culturally responsive care and inclusion. Did I get that right, Jeff?
I think that's close enough. Close enough.
Yeah. So there, with the development of that group, there is also a greater interest of identifying and targeting the higher risk patients for these areas with hypertension control, for example. And at least that's one thing I can say Kaiser does very well, is identifying patients, right? Having a registry and having that availability to us, identifying these patients and tracking them is quote unquote easy for us. And so we're beginning our conversation to discuss how to do that. Actually, not that long ago, last year, our group attempted to make a proposal to the American Heart Association when they announced the funding for a prevention of hypertension program. And we said, well, hey, lifestyle can work for controlling blood pressure. Why not try it to even prevent hypertension? And the reason I brought that up is because when we went through the process of thinking how that would be in a large population based program, then we have to think of the stuff that you and I just discussed, and that we can't do this one-on-one. So we started proposing group-based sessions. We started proposing methods in which so that we can give everybody the same level to start with. We started discussion technology that would help them carry their essential skills with them in their hand so that they can access the information. And then we started discussing what the mechanism so that they can bounce questions, ask their concerns. They go out to eat and they're not sure what they're doing. How would you get that kind of information back from the coaches? Anyway, our program did not get funded, but it did help us think through these issues in terms of the next step of how to implement the stuff that we learned.
I want to build on what you were just asking, because I feel like there's been a revolution in technology with lifestyle coaching that really adapts and adjusts to all the challenges you just met. I mean, Noom, Omada's coaching program, there's so many out there that really have good health literacy content, incorporates technology, apps, motivational interviewing, goal setting, discussion threads. And there's a charge, of course, but I think patients are willing to pay to some extent. And how can those existing technologies be incorporated into the Kaiser system at a subsidy or some other format? Like, why is Kaiser trying to reinvent the wheel?
We haven't been able to find anyone who would share data with us yet. So this is part of the ongoing issue, is that, these apps are private apps. Yes, some of our own research team members sign up for these things, they do it themselves. But we haven't been able to get some of these companies yet to work with us so that we can cut through the clouds and the walls and whatever else we need to cut through to share the data, because we need to be able to have that availability of data to track what these patients are doing.
Got it. Thank you. Steve?
Hi, Steve Chen, USC School of Pharmacy. Even though I'm a pharmacist, I love this study. I'd rather push lifestyle than medications. One question I have, I saw your slide where you showed the number of medications per patient. Sorry I missed it, but I'm trying to figure out what was the average number of medications that each patient received in each arm.
I can't remember off the top of the head. For some reason, I want to say like 2.3, 2.6, but I have to look back to see what the number of.
No, that sounds about right. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's great. I was just thinking about the late Ron Victor's work in the barbershop program in Los Angeles with Black patients. And he was right on par with that number, about 2.6 medications per patient in the intervention arm. That was intensification of therapy by pharmacists. I think the difference was that his algorithm, or the order of medications initiated, was a little bit different. He started, I think you already know, with higher potency or longer acting ARBs with amlodipine. And then after that, he went immediately to either chlorthalidone or indapamide. And so as just from those numbers alone, you're left about 10% of patients that ended up on spironolactone. And I think your process is a little different. I think what I heard is that you promoted spironolactone much earlier than the others. Is that right?
In the study, we try to push it earlier, but to be honest, we didn't see that great percentage of spironolactone use, even in our study. So it was not something that was so easily implemented. I think this is about as good as a pharmacotherapy protocol would go. It's about as far as achieving an 80–85% level of control with the one hat fits all kind of protocol. It's about as good as we see. And then beyond that point, you get into patients who have really highly persistent, uncontrolled blood pressure. You need to try a different approach. Yeah.
Okay.
There's a question in the Q&A, Mai, you can see, but it's really getting at the rising cost of eating healthy and the impact that those rising costs may have on the behavioral changes that have been made. Are patients going to fall back on eating cheaper prepackaged foods that are going to have more salt, more unhealthy components? So what do you say about that, and how can we overcome that?
I think that's a definite risk in this country. Those of you who are involved in policy making, kind of need your help on that angle. I wish there was a way to convince people to limit the amount of sodium we put into things. That is a population health level that is beyond me. But I totally agree with the risk of, the easier, the cheaper, usually is the higher sodium load as far as choices go. And so we would have to try and find way again, we start looking at these angles. We study this in African Americans, but if we take it to Hispanics population, we take it to other populations, we got to think of different things that we could share or suggest for people to do and consider that would have lower content of sodium.
You just text me, I believe. This is Randy.
Oh, right. Yeah, right. Mm-hmm.
Yes, sir. Thank you very much for doing that. I appreciate your personal involvement. I'm under a doctor's observation for internal bleeding to
I wasn't sure if that was a question for the group. Well, it is getting to be 6:15. Hattie, would you like to close the session, or Bill?
I always like to have our chairman ask the last question. Bill Baumer, a wonderful coach on hypertension, has done amazing things with the whole Sacramento region. Can you talk about how you inspired the group?
So thank you for a very fascinating review of that study. Certainly very important. I do share with you the idea that one-on-one coaching may not be feasible as we scale it up for all of us. What we've done in our program is we've had group coaching, i.e. we do our lifestyle coaching with a group where they have Q&A. And if you look at some of the studies that have been done in education, programs that have feedback with groups seem to impart a little bit better knowledge on testing than others. And I think it's very important in a group. You may not have the question that someone else is asking, but that's exactly what you want to know. And when they ask that question, you listen attentively to the answer, because that's something that, oh, I could have thought of that. Yeah, I want to hear what that answer is. So I think that your approach with lifestyle coaching, but going from one-to-one to perhaps group lifestyle coaching, could add advantages as well as economy of scale at that point in time. So it's certainly important. And we all have to come up with better ways of improving hypertension control, especially in certain ethnic and racial groups where we are falling back at this point in time. Unfortunately, Steve's numbers for the country are right. There's been a bump up in less control and higher blood pressure rates. And we've seen that in California as well. And Steve showed Alameda County, but I have the data for all the counties in California. And there are some counties in California that have twice the hypertension rates that others do, and have double or triple the mortality for stroke that other counties do in California. So we have a wide disparity in both racial and ethnic, as well as income levels of counties, as well as whether they're rural or urban at that point for that disparity. So we have a lot of work to do in California, and I want to thank you for presenting this data. It is intriguing that this was an approach. And even though you've got, let's say, a 10% improvement, that's a big number that when we look at blood pressure improvement protocols, getting a 10% increase is a significant benefit to the population that you can see. Many of the trials I've been involved with, we got a 3 or 4% step up in control of blood pressure. So 10 or 11%, I think you should be commended for that. So number one, thank you for doing the study. It helps us to have that incredible information, and we look forward to your follow-up at that point. And we certainly look forward to hearing future innovations that you and Steve can come up with, because Kaiser has really led the way in many of these real world studies that are out there. So on the basis of, on behalf of the Right Care organization, we share your mission, your efforts. We appreciate it. And on behalf of all of us at Right Care and all of the participants today, we certainly want to thank you for an excellent set of presentations today, and look forward to hearing more in the future.
Thanks everyone for joining us next time on June 13th during our Monday noon session. We will be having a special program that could be timely for this difficult problem we have in California with wildfire smoke. So I don't know whether that impacts stroke. You probably do. It probably does, just given the terrible cardiovascular effects. So thank you so much for your passion for this work and for pushing the field along. I love the co-opetition we have in this group to improve stroke outcomes, and just thank you. And we will be in touch further, I hope, with you to learn more. And with that, have a wonderful evening, and we'll see you in a couple of weeks.